Okay, today we're going to take a look at Broken Shores. This is Brutal Survival in a Drowned World. It is by Alex T. and Black Oath Entertainment. Alex is one of my favorite designers of what I consider to be combo GM-less play, heavily solo supported, but also possible to play with a GM or a referee and one or more, ideally one PC. So I think of a lot of his work as almost like, for those of you who are old enough to get the reference to power assist steering, if you remember back in the day when there was no power steering and then there was power steering, but then there was this thing called power assist, which kind of like turned on when you needed it most when you were driving. I look at a lot of his work as like that power assist in terms of solo play. I, of course, have done a solo session with this that I'm going to talk to you about, but I'm getting to the place where I actually want to run one of his games, maybe this one, for somebody, because I love the concept of using the solo material as a GM prompt. So, well, what is this? This is a game. It is a sandbox ocean hexcrawl, and you're doing island exploration in it. You are doing dungeon delving. There are ruins and all sorts of things that you are scavenging around as you take on a role of a drifter. You are a survivor of an ancient cataclysm that sort of ravaged the world, and it turned the world into this kind of watery hellscape as it's described. So you are going to be exploring small islands that have risen up from the sea, as has recently happened in the real world in Japan. And you are going to be attempting to gather materials and do various things and survive the desperate, dire circumstances that you're in. It's a D100 rule set, which I love. This is basically based on something that I'm actually going to cover pretty soon, the what was Call of Cthulhu, the basic role-playing system from Chaosium, where you're taking a stat and you have your basic attributes. We'll look here at my character, where we have our strength, dexterity, etc. But then you multiply that by 5 to get your D100 value, and you get the associated aspect of that value. So your strength turns into a brawn roll. And in this case, my character was very strong and had a 60 on their brawn. And so this type of system, as well as the allocation of points to develop your skills, to have them be also based in the D100 system. So I made a character who had a 54% chance of perceiving things and a 31% chance of doing a stealth, a 42% chance of survival, by allocating the points that are allowed in the system. It is what Alex T does in many of his books, and I think it's very intuitive. I love anything that's based in a D100 or percentile chance, because I think dating back to the James Bond role-playing system from the 80s, I just think for me, it's very intuitive, more so than no matter how many times I play D20 based things with modifiers, it's just not as ingrained as it is for a percentile system. And I think for solo play in particular, just like a glance at my character will tell me who they are and give me a feeling for them. So what happens in this game? Well, what happens in this game is, as mentioned, exploration. It's ocean exploration, it's island exploration. And in my particular game, what happened was I decided there's not really an instruction, I think, as to exactly where you start, whether you can start in the ocean on a boat or you can start on an island. I had myself start on an island, and I began exploring using the mechanics in the book, which we'll look at in a moment. And then my original island was meant to be, per the rules, 25 hexes big. That felt too large, and there is a very optimistic hex sheet here for your ocean exploration. I'm not sure for my style of play that all of that travel would ever happen or even be supported by the tables that are in here. So as I explored my island, I decided to come up with some procedures of my own as to when the island sort of quote unquote ended. And then I made it end, and I ended up then creating another island here. So I've got actually in this island hex exploration worksheet more than one island. That's just, I kind of localized the play a little bit. So let's talk about what the book actually has. As mentioned, the characters here, it says, "Come, drifter, and let us hear your story. The tide is rising, and the abyss never rests." And this is the sense of the world, that it is a dangerous place, and the ocean in particular is very scary. So you have your attributes, they're pretty familiar, and then you have what I mentioned before, which is this associate attribute role that is going to happen when narrative suggests it. And I think that is where this helps with developing a story. So rather than saying, okay, I need to roll dexterity, if something happens that you need to coordinate, when you need to have a reflex or do something that is deft, you would make that roll. And then you have a whole bunch of skills that you can decide what you want. So you build out your character. Everybody has all the skills, but you are building up certain skills in the character creation process by strengthening some of them more than others. And you also have the option, there is magic in this world. It's extremely dangerous to use. And at a certain point, I modified that rule, as I'll explain to you. But basically, you can opt to take some spells instead of developing your skills. And the skills available show you a little bit about what you're doing in the world. So you have a survival skill, for example, that will help you with tracking and fishing and avoiding natural hazards, because this is both an overland exploration, probably, well, I don't want to say mostly, but it is equally an overland and over ocean exploration, as it is, you can definitely do some dungeon delving if you find some ruins, which you can do through the random tables that are provided. So you have, for example, a sailing skill that you could develop. You have medicine and various types of martial weapons, as well as manipulation, because you will encounter NPCs. And in fact, right away, as I started out, I encountered a castaway, and it was a stranded castaway, and she was kind of friendly and actually a little bit drunken. She had been sort of lost on the shores in the jungle, and she had some alcohol with her. So when we encountered her, she was hanging out with herself, and she joined our party, and she helped us along the way. You also get talents. It says new characters begin the game with 2 talents, and then you can get more talents during the course of the game, which represents a sort of way of leveling up. So you could, for example, have the talent of camouflage to immediately pass all stealth checks if you want to hide, or you could be gifted in a certain way, so you can re-roll a particular skill. I really like this because it's kind of a nice narrative way to further hone your character and make them a real type. You can have the healer talent or a marksman talent. This is one I wish I had taken, Moon Touch, +20 when rolling on the spell effect table. As we'll see, the ability to cast spells, the ability to have spells which are helping you, does not necessarily mean they're going to function properly. It does not mean that you may catch the wind of the deities that will cause bad things to happen from the spell. So you need to roll on this table when you're casting a spell and just determine how it works. You get, for character creation, some little narrative backstory that may impact your stats, what happened. It says you start your story not as a fresh drifter, but as one more of the many prisoners aboard a temple ship belonging to a cult, and you find out mine had been captured by the Fated, and then later on in the book there is the lore about what these cults are and their impact in the world. You get some tables for why you were captured, how long, and how you escaped, and then the escape part is going to impact your actual numbers in your character. So it's tying a little story to an impact in the values that you have starting out. You can optionally choose to steal something and then get the benefit of what you steal as well as the detriment. Again, nice choice at character creation to give your character some flavor and something that they've already done prior to coming to this story. This is how you level up in the game. I'm going to skip over that for the purposes of this video. It's not super essential to get a flavor for it, but the bottom line is that the things that you do in the game, the choices that you make, the roles that you make are contributing to how you are leveling up. There are difficulty modifiers that you can. I made myself a little random chart for that, or I should say, I took their random chart and fixed it up because it's a little confusing here. So if I wanted to randomly determine how difficult something would be, I could just give a roll here and then come up with that. And the modifier number is referring to increasing your relevant stat. So that's why it's a plus. If something's going to be easier, you are going to add to your stats. So if you have a 70% chance of doing something, but it's like super, super child's play, well, you don't even need to roll for it because it's not going to be 100% successful, for example. So this is helpful. It's not in the section with the solo support, but as a soloist, it's very helpful to you. Combat has the opportunity to have dodging and parrying as well as initiative, and these are based on the combat rules that you're making. You have a lot of different combat options that you have to try to take somebody's weapon, for example, or to grapple with them. And the reason this is useful is you're starting out really with not a lot of stuff. And depending on what you encounter, I encountered 3 cannibals pretty early on where my only opportunity really was to try to take their stuff or to push them away because I didn't have the making just a traditional roll with the little weapon I had was not going to get me very far. So the fact that there are so many different options here kind of enlivens the combat. That said, sometimes the combat runs a little long because you are able to try to dodge your way out of trouble. And even though every time you use a dodge ability in combat, the next time you use it, you have to lower your chances by, I believe it's 30. So for example, the first time I dodge, I got a 71% chance of doing it effectively. But the next time I use it, it's 71 minus 30. So it does, decrease the success of that. But even so, because the enemies can dodge too, sometimes it can get a little lengthy with combat, especially if you have multiple enemies. And I also had my castaway fighting for me with those 3 cannibals at the outset. So I tried to do a little bit of a modification to the combat rules. I'm not going to say I was very successful at it, figuring out what is fair to engage in combat, but not super, super long. So that's something I need to continue to consider. There are a number of places in the game where you have usage dies and things that will be taking up time, taking up resources. And if you're familiar with the system, I also really love this way of working. So you start out with a particular die value and you keep rolling it until you roll a 1 or a 2, and then you move down the chain. So each time you are doing something to keep track of the days passing. I used it for also travel because there wasn't, as I saw it necessarily, a particular built-in way of keeping track of that when rations needed to be consumed, for example, when you actually needed to set up camp. There are optional rules for major wounds, critical hits, what those could mean. And again, having tables like this and having the random table for, well, what does it mean if you do a critical hit with piercing and the impact of it? That's great. It just adds a lot of flavor. It helps you visualize the combat in a dynamic way. And again, for solo play, I think that is wonderful. There's a critical hit table for sorcery as well for fumbles. Perhaps unsurprisingly, there's a number of conditions that you can acquire in the course of the game. Blindness, you can charm a creature, you can entangle something, there's fear, and then the impacts there's a whole bunch of them. There's scurvy and fatigue. Again, you are exploring, you're on these islands, and it does give you the real feel of that. You can also craft, so it does give you a sense of being alone in the wilderness. And here's the discussion of timers, and it's saying it gives you the general rule that sometimes you need to keep track of a number of different things and how you can do that. Sailing and ocean movement has its own risks. So you could have sailing fumbles, you can become lost at sea, you have a vessel that could get damaged. At the outset, you have this raft that you're starting with, and you can choose to improve your raft or not during the course of the game. I didn't really focus so much on that, but that dimension of the rule set is yet another thing I think that sets this apart from your average solo or GM-less kind of sandbox game, because you are dealing with the water and you're dealing with not overland travel, but over ocean travel. Here we get to the GM-less rules and tools, and there are some familiar ones like a basic oracle table here that if an action is whatever, you can roll your d20 and determine whether or not it happens. There's also a complication table that goes with that if you want to use it to further determine and locate what the complication is. So maybe it's a physical environment change, or maybe you get a useful item either found or lost. I think this direction, when games have the additional table that will go a little bit deeper and direct you a little bit more toward what actually it is that is happening, I think that's always quite helpful. Action and theme spark tables, fantastic. I use them as you do, or as I do, when I needed to sort of change a scene, or I needed to do something, or we had just concluded a combat. Well, then what happens? I would roll on the action and theme table as I was deciding, say, well, we're going to travel, but let's get some sense of where we're going or why we're going. So, for example, after a combat, I rolled suppress benefit. And that was going to be a travel thing. And I decided that that had to do with the story that I was developing to take this castaway who was giving me aid, take this castaway back to where she came from. And it kind of worked its way into the story like that. There are creature combat actions. It says in order to simulate an opponent's decision-making process using these tables, and they are different tables depending on the health of the creature. So this is another thing that can add to the length of combat, but at the same time, it's kind of a trade-off, because it does, I don't want to say it adds to the veracity of the combat, because none of it's very realistic, but it helps you visualize what's going on. That perhaps at 50% or less health, they're going to coordinate with their allies in some way, and then you could decide what that actually meant. We also have a table for initial encounters, whether they are going to attack or not. You can build out some of these NPCs in terms of their gender and age, their motivations. We have a D100 table for motivations and descriptions. Again, this is useful for other games, but it is useful just to flesh out the world and make it really come alive. And then you could also roll on what are they actually doing when you encounter them. And they are, when I encountered my castaway, I rolled that she was being intoxicated. That's how that happened. That's how that came up. And then I built a story around that and why she was there. We get into sorcery and spellcasting, and this is where you can see you have to cast spells, you need to use some power points that you have been given at the beginning of the game, and they refresh each other during the course of a day. And you make a tenacity check. But that doesn't mean the spell is going to work, because there are God shards in this world. These are fragments of gods. They are very, very rare. You can come across them during exploration. I have yet to find any. But the issue is when you cast a spell without them, you then need to determine whether or not you have a spell effect. And most of the spell effects here are bad, or many of them are bad, and it's based on a D100 unmodified roll. So it is risky to indulge in magic without them. You also have, when you pick up spells, this is kind of cool, each spell has an idiosyncrasy. So again, it's a D66 roll that you are doing to, when you attain the spell, you might get something like it's requiring twice as usual power points to be cast, or when you cast it, nearby vegetation is going to wither when it is cast. So things of that nature, which kind of add a little, they're quirks to the game that are that can add some flavor. And then there's the list of the D20 spells that are there. And I do appreciate that it is randomized. There are cases where you may attain a random spell, or an NPC might come with a random spell, or a talent might give you a random spell, or something like that. Then there is a big section on the various deities and the types of powers that they do offer, and they will bestow both passive and active abilities. And more here on the background of the deities. I'm not going to get into too much detail about all of that, because I want to move forward and show you there are procedures for exploration, weather, and things of that nature. There are ocean exploration steps that you take. And again, I showed earlier in the video, there's this massive hex map that is meant to represent the oceans that you are traveling through, and then the more detailed, the localized island map that is going to be for the islands that you're discovering. I think for my situation, as I said, rather than being faced with what seemed overwhelming and also optimistic given the content here. There's a lot of content here, but I don't think there's like quite this much content here. I chose to make my initial 25 hex island into a bigger map with smaller islands, and I set up this procedure of using up the usage die to determine when I found a new, the end of the shore, and then I got to more ocean exploration. You have a D100 table of ocean findings that you could have, and some of these, we're not going to read them so much, but some of them are just like there's nothing, or there's like a thing in the water, and some of them are a bit more involved. And then there are some other tables here with a demonic corruption table, if you encounter that, some complications of exploration and other types of encounters, and then a list of NPCs that you can encounter, which is how I came into a meeting with the cannibals. And you do have, later in the book, you have the stats for those enemies somewhere in a small bestiary, somewhere in the back here. There is, in addition to the overland portion of this, you can have what amount to dungeon crawls. These are derelicts or types of ruins that you would encounter, and there are some tables to determine how many entrances there are, room connectors. You can map these out if you wish, and there are combat encounters, things you might find, traps and things. So a nice collection here of the sort of random tables you would expect when creating what amounts to a solo dungeon crawl. For the travel, you have a table here to indicate if you're in, for example, a hill area, you're going to be rolling a d20, and it will tell you what is next in terms of the composition of that. For this kind of table, I expected there to be a little bit more random tables keyed toward the terrain. There really isn't that. So you need to bring to that, if you're dealing with the terrain, a little bit of your own story there, because you're not given in this book individual random tables for each type of terrain. And some more tables here for exploration and findings. We have the landmark object and landmark descriptor, and this is something that you can roll on really obviously at any point. If you're looking around, you could decide that you're doing your own exploration roll to then, at a success, allow you to come up with something that you find here. And or there are also tables in the book that say, you found a landmark, and then you would then roll on this as a prompt into determining what it is. And similar tables here for ruins that you may find in terms of the size and other hazards, what the original purpose was, and its peculiarity. And then localized more spark tables for room detail as well as the theme of the room. So again, these tables could be useful in other games, and certainly in this one I have already used this. This is what in a different video I was doing, I pulled this out for one of these tables and was reminded that I never had actually done the video for this one. So the book has utility beyond itself, as often Alex T's work does. There's a ruin events table, D20 ruin events table, and at a certain point, we have settlement tables and NPC encounters. If you are lucky enough to find a settlement, you create your settlement. And then some more tables here in the back for things like weapons, and these have an associated cost. So you start out with a certain amount of money at the beginning of the game, but really nowhere to spend it unless you decide you're going to start out in a settlement. You could say that you're in a settlement and buy things. I didn't do that. I had a fair amount of money that I was carrying around because it gave me like a mini goal to try to keep exploring until I found a settlement. And then you could do some selling and trading, and you have the associated prices here. But these things are also randomized. So if you find, for example, a random weapon, it is a nicely numbered table already for you. And as the soloist, I really do appreciate that. There's a bunch of random tables for different types of loot. So there's mundane loot, like a Carl pendant. Again, you could decide what you might or might not use that for. There are different types of seeds that you can attain, which I found at one point some seeds. There are rations, and you need to feed yourself. So I used that as a ration, which was helpful. There's valuable loot. There's some jewelry, some precious loot things, including the God Shard here, which, as I said, I have not found in my game yet. It's pretty hard to find. And then there are also artifacts. Well, we'll get to the artifacts in a moment, but you have potions and you have minor magic items. One of the things that I do like, and this is the case in certain games, is if you find a potion, you're only going to roll on the table after you've ingested it. So that is just a little bit of sort of fog of war, as it were, for you, not really knowing what your potion is. And then there are some minor magic items. And again, you could see that these types of tables could be brought into other games. And finally, we have some artifacts that get a little bit more explanation here and are tied narratively to the story of the world. And then we have some section on basically the bestiary and the stats for those NPCs that you could encounter in the world as you travel through. So again, from Alex T and Black Oath Entertainment, a lot in a small package. I think the concept of the island exploration, the survival aspect of it, that you're in the wilderness, you need to be paying attention to your making camp and the rations, and the idea that you are going to be traveling in an almost limitless ocean, as well as then coming upon small islands and then even smaller ruins or places you can scavenge on those islands, really marries kind of micro settings with macro settings very effectively to create the sense of being alone in a world and having a I can't say an infinite sandbox, but a lot of feeling of a big sandbox to play in with the tables that are here. As I said, what I did miss a little bit was more tables geared toward the terrain type specifically, but even without that, there is a large range and variety of tables and different types of environments that it does feel different when you're out on the open sea as opposed to when you are exploring the landscape of the ocean and the landscape of an island, and then finding something on the island like a ruin or whatever to go into and explore the interior of that kind of ruin.